Jason Burgess, and we're going to start a study today on the book of John, one of the four Gospels. One of the best ways, and the best ways that I believe to study the Scriptures is to try to get to the meaning of it, is to look at before we get into John, I just want to set these groundwork, but look at what the original author meant, what they were trying to say. The original intent. The intent of the original author is what we're looking at. It's interesting in the book of John, he actually gives that to us. He gives us the reason he wrote this. Of course, there's four Gospels. This is the Gospel according to John, but there's four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. They're all different. They talk about the same person. They don't contradict one another, but they come from a different perspective. And the first thing you ask with John is, who was John? Understanding context. Context is a key in understanding Scripture and being able to apply it to our lives. So who was John? John was one of the disciples. He was quite young when he started to follow Jesus. He refers to himself as the beloved disciples. He was one of the inner circle with Jesus. You know, Jesus had the 12, which eventually were the 11 because of Judas. But he had the 12. But then there was three of them that were really close to Jesus, and John was one of those, Peter, James, and John. So this was a disciple. John was a disciple. He wrote 4 other books in the New Testament, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, and he also wrote Revelation at an older age. He's the only disciple, according to history and according to tradition, that was not martyred. He died late in life, like most scholars believe, in his 90s, which is when he wrote Revelation. God revealed to him on an island what the end's going to look like, and that's how he wrote Revelation. But this gospel, according to John, this book that he wrote, most people believe was written somewhere after AD 70, probably in maybe mid-70s or early 80s. After the fall of Rome was destroyed. The temple was destroyed in AD 70. And so he wrote this. He wrote this specifically to people. And he tells us in John 20:31, he says why he wrote it. But listen to this. So this sets the trajectory of when we're studying the Gospel according to John. We understand what John was trying to accomplish. He helps us to understand what he's saying. He says this. Now, this is actually John 20:30 and 31. He says, "Now Jesus did many other signs in the presence of the disciples, which are not written in this book." You'll notice as we study through this over the coming weeks that John highlights specific miracles and signs that Jesus was giving. And what he's saying there is they didn't record all of it. But he did say in verse 31, "But these are written." In other words, I wrote this so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. So John is saying, I wrote this with it evangelism intent. In other words, he wrote this book because he saw, he was with Jesus. He saw him in his ministry. He saw him heal. He saw the miracles. He followed him. And then he saw how Jesus worked after he died and arose. So he's looking back and he's writing. He's looking back over his life when he was a young teen and he started to follow Jesus. Things he said. He was there at the death. He was there at the resurrection. He was there. He was there. He was one of the first ones to the tomb. And now he's looking back, he's looking at the early church. Look at the book of Acts. He was there. He was a part of the early church. And he's saying, I wrote this because I want you to know that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, that by believing in him, you may have life in his name. So that's who John was. Now, the Gospels, when I say Gospels, I mean Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. They kind of have their own genre of their own because they're not narrative, although they have narrative. They're not history books, although they have history in them. The more we find out, the more we see that these Gospels, and Scripture as a whole, by the way, is historically accurate. But a Gospel kind of has its own genre. And it does give accounts. So John, you'll notice, gives accounts but it has an intent with the account. He's saying, this is what happened. This is pointing to who Jesus is. And it's interesting, there's 21 chapters, right? Let me make sure I'm right on that. 21, yeah. 21 chapters in the book of John. And most of it is giving account of things that he did, things that he said, and he gives some commentary along the way. But the first 14 verses are interesting. They're not giving an account. It's what they call a prologue. And the first 14 verses, which we're going to talk about the first 4 or 5 this first session here, but are really John setting the trajectory of who Jesus is. Because that's what I want us to explore when we read through this book of John. We're asking the question, who is Jesus? Who is Jesus? And John's saying to you, this is who Jesus is. So he starts with these first few verses, these first 14 verses. It's interesting. They're very deep. He's setting off his view of Christ and who he is. And so we're going to spend a couple sessions, I think, in these first 14 verses, but that's where we are today. We're going to begin with John chapter 1, verse 1. Listen to the first verse here. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Let me read that again. John 1:1. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Kind of odd wording, isn't it? In our context, if you stood up in front of a group, or if you were talking to someone on the phone, or communicating, hanging out with someone, having dinner, and you use these words, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. It's interesting. But notice those first 3 words. In the beginning. Does that sound familiar? In the beginning. The first words of the Bible, right? Genesis 1:1. In the beginning. Listen to it. You see here the intent of John. He's trying to go all the way back. But listen to Genesis 1:1 here. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. In the beginning. John starts with in the beginning. Now, if you look at the other Gospels, again, Gospels are accounts of Jesus, his life. Matthew and Luke Matthew starts with genealogy, John too somewhat, but they start with Jesus is a baby. So they begin AD 3 to BC 3, somewhere in that period, around that time. John goes all the way back to the beginning. He says in the beginning, he's setting the tone to remember what he's doing here. He's starting here right off the bat. He's setting the tone of explaining who Jesus is. So he says, in the beginning was the Word. And the Word was with God, and the Word was God. So let's touch. So keep in mind here, John's going all the way back to the beginning. He's saying in the beginning. Okay. Now this whole word used here. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. What does he mean by that word? Word. It's hard to even explain because it's the word. You understand what I'm saying? But it's odd. What does he mean here? John goes all the way back. What is the term word here? And it's not used often in our culture as the way that John used it. The word here, which is logos in the original, here is John is basically referring to Christ as the Word. So you can replace Christ. In the beginning was Christ, and Christ was with God, and Christ was God. But why did he use Word? Why did he use Word? And if you look at the meaning of it, so this word means it was used a lot in that culture and even in the Old Testament culture, because John's probably writing mainly to Jews here, whose temple had been destroyed. And so he's trying to communicate to them, know that it's different now. There's a new covenant, he's saying. What is the word? So in essence, what John's saying here is he's referring to Christ as the Word, meaning that he is God's self-expression. So in the beginning was God's self-expression, and this self-expression was with God, and this self-expression was God. Meaning that he is God's self-expression. So he's saying Jesus was the Word, and what Jesus was God's self-expression. You remember Jesus saying, what God is saying here, he's saying, this is who I am. This is me. This Word, Jesus, communicated to the world. So when John refers to Jesus as the Word, he's saying, this is God. This is God's expressing himself to this world. So God had to break into, and we're going to talk about this later, about God coming to this realm, to our world. And how he did it was through Jesus. And the Word, Jesus, is God's self-expression. So that's why that word is used there. But it's interesting, he says there, and the Word was with God. And the Word was God. It can be confusing. I know this is deep stuff, and if you'll flow through me, if you'll hang with me through this, we're explaining who Jesus is here. What John's saying who Jesus is, we're going to get into the narrative. It gets easier to follow, but this is deep stuff here. It's very important for us to understand this, so we get on the foundation and get sent off into the way that we need to go with exploring of who Christ is. So this idea that in the beginning was Jesus, and Jesus was with God, but Jesus was God. That's Trinity, which is difficult to grasp, obviously. It's where we get the term God in three persons. It's interesting here, and I remember these conversations, and I have these sometimes to people, but I remember as a freshman in college, sitting in the hall, discussing with young 18-year-olds and 19-year-olds who for the first time are out from underneath their parents' care. And we were discussing, and this guy brought up the question, and because we were talking about who God was, or is there a God? And the guy said, if there is a God, where did he come from? A good question, isn't it? Good question. And what John's saying here is, he's always been. So in other words, he didn't come from anything. He's eternal. Now this is obviously difficult for us to grasp. So you ask, who is God? Well, he's actually God in three persons here. We see the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. If you go back to Genesis 1:1, in fact, before this realm was created, okay, it says here, talks about how the Spirit of God hovered over the nothingness. The earth was without form and void, and the darkness was over the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. And God said, let there be light. So if you go back to where did Jesus come from, he's always existed. He's God. And that's where God has always existed. He's bigger than we can grasp. If we could grasp the Trinity, then he wouldn't be God, right? If we could fully grasp it in our human minds. So that's setting the tone here. We see the Trinitarian bent here. In the beginning was the Word, and Jesus, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. So we have these three persons together existed. The God of the Bible, the Yahweh, the one true God, is three persons who existed. Not three gods. It's important that we understand this. He's God, and these three persons were together. Okay? So this word logos, in other words, let's get back to that, since we touched on Trinity a little bit, but grasping this was that Jesus was the expression of God. He was God in the flesh. Now, he was with God. He was God. And we don't want to turn this into a Trinity lesson. First of all, because I'm not qualified to do it. I don't know if I know enough about it to grasp it. But I do understand. This is where I fall. Is Jesus is one God, a good and gracious God in three persons. And John starts it off with this. Verse 2, he was in the beginning with God. They were together. And then it goes on in verse 2. Listen to this. I guess let me go back before that. To summarize it, I think you say Paul saying here, Paul was, or John is saying here, in the beginning, he was already there. So that's who Jesus is. Then he goes on in verse 3 here. All things were made through him, and without him was not anything made that was made. That's interesting. So Jesus has always existed. He's God. He's the personification of God. And it says here, in him was life, and life, verse 3. All things were made through him, and without him was not only anything made that was made. So, Colossians 1:16. Look at this. Colossians 1:16. Listen to what it says here. Talking about this whole idea of how things are made and what they're made for. It says here, for by him all things were created. Talking about Jesus, in heaven and on earth, visible and indivisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities. All things were created through him and for him. So verse 3 here. Listen to this. Verse 3, John 3. All things were made through him, and without him was not anything made that was made. In other words, Jesus is the beginning of all. So you got to ask yourself, God is the uncreated one, okay? So he was uncreated. But it's through him all things came to be, and through him gives the reason for all things. Now, what do we do with that? If Jesus was God, the self-expression of God, and everything started through him who already always existed, what do we do with that? How should that? Let's talk about a little bit of application here. Let's talk a little application here, because we've kind of gone through a lot of extensive stuff here. We're going to end this session. What do we do with that? If God is through things all things are created, through him all things are created, and he is the purpose for all things, what do we do with that as people? Why aren't we here? And no matter where you are, whatever context you're in, I realize that this is from the senior center, so probably senior adults are watching this. You got to ask yourself, if I was created by him and for him, how does that affect the way I do life? First of all, it takes a lot of pressure off us. I think you would agree, of making life all about us. Because when we make life all about us, or all about relationships or money or anything other than God, eventually we are felt empty. It's like drinking salt water. So just rest in that. Rest in that he is, from him all things came, through him all things were made, and for the purpose of him all things exist. Rest in that. Thank him for making you. Thank him for still using you. Rest in that. So, John starts us off here in these first 4 verses. We're going to end this session, but these first 4 verses, he starts it off here saying, in the beginning was Jesus. Jesus has always been there. He was with God the Father. He goes all the way back. He's always existed. He's the uncreated one. And through him and by him and for him, all things are created. That's where John's taking us, to set us off into this gospel, which we get into some narrative here and some accounts of that. But we got another session on, a couple sessions on what he means in these first 14 verses. So I know this was wordy, and you can tell I have deficiencies in trying to explain it because it is deep. It's to try to explain and understand and grasp the uncreated one is humanly impossible. So I pray the Lord is teaching you through this. We'll get back into verses 4. Start at verse 4 next time. Hope you're having a great week. Thank you.